family has been created by God, instituted by God as the primary place to train and correct a child, ultimately so they can relate rightly to their creator. You are listening to the Maven Parent Podcast. I've just always wanted to do that. Do I have that smooth, silky voice, like you are listening to that work? Can we start doing that as the new intro to the Maven Parent Podcast?
I'm sure that'll pull people right in.
Oh, jeez. Okay, well, you are actually listening to the Maven Parent Podcast. Mm-hmm. I'm your host, Brett Kunkel.
And I'm your host.
You're supposed to say co-host.
Well, why don't you say I'm your co-host, Brett Kunkel, and then I say, and I'm your co-host?
Because if you lead, you say you're the host, and then the second person says the co-host. But what would be implied is that you're both co-hosting together.
Really? Okay, well then I'll lead and say, I'm your host, Erin Kunkel.
And I'm your co-host, Brett Kunkel.
Okay, so we've been talking about the topic of discipline.
Which is a serious topic, so let's get serious.
Yeah, get serious. And we've been talking about the topic of discipline over several episodes now.
4.
We are
3.
This is number 4.
This is number 4.
Yeah, so we're going to keep going through it and hoping that you are feeling encouraged and equipped more in this topic as we think about it from a Christian worldview as parents and grandparents who might be listening as well.
Yeah, and that's the key. We are laying a foundation, a Christian worldview foundation for discipline. So we want to do a little bit more of that today.
Yeah.
As we move towards a lot of practical ideas on how then to discipline. But, and this is, I think, important, right? To think of what discipline is before you think about the how of discipline. Mm-hmm. And that's really with almost anything. If you want to know how something is to function properly or how it's supposed to work or how we're supposed to approach it, you start by asking, what is that thing? Like, take any appliance in the house, a toaster, a blender, an oven. If you want to know how that thing operates or how it functions, you ask, well, what is it? And in the same way, that's what we're doing with discipline and then laying out this bigger worldview. So
we ended last time talking about basically this idea that discipline brings about human flourishing for all human beings, not just children, but for everybody. It brings about flourishing. And so therefore, if that's true, then lack of authority, lack of discipline leads actually to chaos. And I recently found an article on salon.com that I think illustrates the chaos piece to it really well. And actually, it's very sad to read about because it does bring about so much chaos. But so this article that I found on salon.com was titled, "Boomer Parents Destroyed Us. I Needed Rules and Boundaries, Not Parents Who Wanted to Be Friends." And from the very start of the article, the author is upfront in her motives of sharing her story. And she says, in the past few years, hippie culture has had something of a revival. And what's this hippie culture she's talking about? Well, the hippie creed, she says, is no rules, no limits. And she talks about growing up in this boomer hippie mom. And she talks about this dark side to this intoxicating rejection of rules and boundaries. And there was no one left to assume the adult role that she needed in her life. She says, people like my parents may have had the best intentions, but in a wide-eyed quest for social change, they became children, and their actual children suffered as a result. She goes on to say that kids need limits. Someone in the family unit has to take the adult role, preferably the adults themselves. On the commune that she lived, I actually begged my mom for rules. Let's have a rule where children should be seen and not heard. Or let's have a rule where kids have to go to bed at a certain time every night. I longed for discipline, for someone to tell me, that's quite enough of that, young lady. This was presented to the children as the natural order of things, but we knew there was something wrong. She goes on to describe how her and her brother hated the lack of lucky charms, boundaries, and discipline. And then she goes on to describe a life of complete chaos. She got a joint for her 7th birthday. Her first sexual encounter with a grown man was at 8 years old. And by the time she turned 30, she had had over 150 sexual partners. She ends by saying, growing out of the anger I felt has allowed me to admit, I don't want novel hippie parents to make the same mistake with their kids that the first hippies did. Once you have kids, finding yourself should never trump the goal of giving your kids a safe, thoughtfully limited environment. And just to be clear, the author of this article was not a Christian and didn't claim to be. It was just really a reflection on what she's seeing now is popular in parenting culture. And she's giving a warning of what the outcome of this can look like. So what do we learn from this really tragic story?
Well, I think one thing that we learn is that your moral views influence how you parent. Mm-hmm. So if you don't think there are objective moral values, if you think there's no God, there are no objective moral values, that human beings simply determine what's right and wrong, those are merely preferences, then this kind of parenting seems to be the logical consequence.
Yeah, it
right?
is the logical outworking of that idea if it's all relative.
Yeah, everything is relative to the individual. The individual decides. And so this is how I'm going to raise my kid. And again, there's no objective right and wrong here. It turns out to be personal preferences.
And you know what I think proves that to be just completely false is this woman's reflection and reaction to that relativistic view taken to its logic, what we would say its logical outworking. And so her desire for discipline as a little girl, asking her mom, let's pretend I have a bedtime, because she lived in this house with no boundaries whatsoever. She's longing for these boundaries. So where the heck is that coming from? Yeah. Where is that coming from?
Yeah, it's coming from the law written on her heart that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 2 in verses 14 and 15, right? That we have a conscience built in. We have God's law written on our heart. It's part of the furniture of the universe, this moral universe that we live in. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Her then reflecting and reacting against this is like, well, wait, this is what you were trained with. This is what you were raised with. Wouldn't you just accept it? No, because if there is an objective moral reality, it doesn't matter what we believe against that. That doesn't change the nature of reality. It's true, and this is a great definition for something that's objectively true, means it's true whether anyone believes it or not. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's so vital for us to have these strong convictions about what is right and true and good.
Yeah, she says in the article, kids need limits. Where is she getting that idea? You know, this and that is pointing to outside of her. And I think too, her reflections also point us to another truth about the article, and that, you know, God, when he establishes this moral law for human beings, it is based in our good. He's not just this dictator who's established these rules just to be mean or the because I said so kind of thing. He actually knows that we need boundaries, and that's what she's when she says kids need limits, she's referring to that truth that God knows about us as human beings, and that we can know too, is that we need limits. We need boundaries.
Yeah. And this story does demonstrate kind of in an extreme way the result of not having rules and laws and boundaries. And what's the result? The result is chaos. The result is pain and woundedness. The result is instability. The result is a lack of safety and security for her. I mean, you can just imagine how unstable her life was as a little child, you know. And now her reflections back are expressing a desire. I mean, if we could just remember that deep down, our kids need discipline, and often because they need it, they also want it. Whether they would articulate it that way or not, whether they would articulate it in the moment that they're getting disciplined, right? And what is discipline? It is training to correct. So,
and the Hebrews 12 even, makes that like no discipline in the moment feels good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like no, our kids will not love in the moment that we are, disciplining them, training them, whatever. They're not going to be like, thank you, mother and father.
Yeah.
And so, we shouldn't have that expectation. And actually, we should have the expectation that in the moment, it's going to be hard and difficult.
Yeah. And so hopefully it's like I guess farming, not that I have a lot of experience farming, but I'm, with these farming analogies of sowing and, you're sowing seeds, you're cultivating the land. There's a lot of, I don't even know the correct farm terms, whatever, cultivating, tending, that's it. You tend to the land for a long time before you ever reap. And so that's one thing I think is important to think about and to remember as parents on this kind of journey of discipline, is that there's a lot of harvesting, and some of that reaping doesn't happen till later on. And the ultimate goal is that, I guess not goal, but one of the payoffs at the end maybe is when the kids get older and they can look back now, as this adult has done in the story, and kind of say, yeah, I needed that and I wanted that. And even if they can't articulate that now, but it's just a good reminder for us. Kids do need it and they want it.
Yeah. And I think we do want to make the connection too, that they need it from us because they're going to need it later in life. They're going to need it when they go off to school. They're going to need it in other relationships as well. And so learning this submission to authority, learning discipline is really good. And if we don't do it at home, then it does affect their other relationships. And we want to talk about how, of course, this would affect their relationship with God. Because and I think this is best illustrated when we think about, my mom's a teacher. We have lots of friends that are teachers. And so you think about the classroom, right? And the first day of school, any teacher would tell you that within the first half an hour of being with the kids, they know which kids come from homes where they have to submit to authority, and which kids come from homes where they don't have to submit to authority. Any teacher will tell you this. Well, why? Is it because they survey the class and say, at home, do you have to listen to rules? Mark yes or no. No, they don't have to. How do they know? They know because of how the children treat them as authorities in their life. And so if you think about it in the home translated to the schoolroom, now take it the home translated to God, creator of the universe, and how we're setting our kids up to ultimately submit to God as the authority of their lives.
Yeah, if discipline is training to correct, well, what is it that you're training, and what is it you're correcting? Well, it turns out it's the will. It's the human will, right? We are training the will to learn how to obey, and obey is a form of submission, and ultimately to submit to God, because that's the way that this world is structured. We all have to submit. If you don't learn how to submit to authority, you're going to have a difficult time in this world. Because whether it's submitting to parents, or submitting to school teachers, or submitting to college professors, or submitting to a boss, or submitting to the police, or submitting to the local government, or submitting to the federal government, right? All of life, it's like all these different arenas. There's this submission that's needed in order to flourish. And ultimately, there's a submission to God that's needed. So this training, this correction is training the will to be comfortable with submitting, to learn how to submit, to actually see how submission is a good thing. And this is probably why even when we use the word submission, we've been conditioned by our culture that that's a bad word. It's not a good word. No one typically has these really good, warm, fuzzy feelings when they hear the word submit. It has this baggage because we don't see it as a good thing. And this is why we've got to revisit the Christian worldview on this. Submission is actually a good thing because ultimately the end of the age will, and judgment will end with every knee bowing, and tongue confessing that Jesus Christ is Lord. So there's an ultimate submission to the ruler of this universe. So that's where discipline, the process of discipline is training that will. And that's where things like habits become a very important piece of this.
Yeah, I think, and that's where we want to go, I think, next is talking about starting to get towards the practical of what this, okay, so these big ideas now, what does this actually look like in a home? And I think a really good way to think about it is in terms of forming habits in our children, because forming habits can, affects how they think about things, what becomes normal to them. And so thinking about it in a way of habit training and a way of training their affections, a way of training to what they think of and know to be good and what they think of and know to be wrong.
Yeah, which you mentioned the affections, and that's good because I had just mentioned the will, but it's actually more than the will. The will is, if you kind of think of a human person, right? We have a will. We have the term will often uses volition. And it's this ability to choose, this agency we have. But we are also rational creatures. So there's probably an aspect of discipline that gives rational training. And then you've got maybe the emotions, or the affections would be a little bit different than the emotions, but the affections might include the emotions, our desires, our loves, all of that together. So discipline is really training the whole person.
Yeah. Yeah. And you brought up the rational, which it leads well to this C.S. Lewis quote that I want to talk about, because the rational comes later, right, with kids. And so when they're little, we're training. I think it is good to think about the affections and nurturing that when they're young. And
before you get to that, let's get to that C.S. Lewis quote. But no, it made me think of parents who have come to you, or even just observing parents, and it's like it just makes me think of that parent has a 3-year-old, and they're trying to discipline them, but in their discipline, they start going into this long explanation to the 3-year-old about why this is wrong and why you don't do this. And that doesn't fit at that stage.
Yeah, because the 3-year-old can't reason that way. They're just they're starting to make sense of the world around them, but they don't have the capability to argue well and to see a reason and say, okay, now that makes sense, I'll go ahead and do that.
To think more abstractly about the reasons why my behavior was bad.
Yeah, they're just very concrete and can't rationalize. And this is what in the book Weight of Glory, Lewis talks about the training and habits as a way that we can train their conscience. And he says, human beings must be trained in obedience to the moral institutions almost before they have them, and the years before they are rational enough to discuss them, or they will be corrupted before the time of discussion arrives. So he's talking about this idea about habits being vital when they're so young that even before they get to the rational stage, they've already been trained in their affections to want to do the good and to avoid the wrong. And I just think that is such a good, healthy way to think about the training of our kids through the idea of instilling habits in their lives that makes what is good something that becomes what's normal, and in the process is shaping their hearts as young people.
Yeah. So this is, and what Lewis says is that they've got to be trained in this obedience before they get to these moral institutions, which I'm just kind of relating this back to what we said in the last podcast. There's different spheres of authority, right? So you have parents, you have the church for believers, you have you have a boss in the workplace, you might have community leaders, you have government. Well, before they get out there into those other realms, where's the starting point? Where is this obedience to take place before they get to these other institutions that Lewis is talking about? And what prepares them to be in those institutions? It's mom and dad. It's the home. In fact, that I think goes back to the analogy you just used about the teachers. Or before they go to the teachers, they're getting training in the home. If they get the proper home training, if they get the proper discipline at home, then they won't be corrupted before that time. They will be trained before they get to those institutions, so that when they get to those institutions, when they get to school, they're prepared now. They've learned obedience and submission, and they'll be prepared for that classroom setting. And this is why, you talk to school teachers today, and a lot of them are distraught because they are getting children in their classrooms who have had no discipline and no kind of training in righteousness. So now it's breaking into chaos in the classrooms. And I've talked to teachers who have just have been so disturbed and distraught by how much of their efforts are going into the discipline of kids and trying to correct behavior. And then guess what? Education is undermined. True education then is undermined because half the time you're trying to correct. And this then helps us, I think, to make a connection between the moral instruction and the academic instruction. We kind of maybe have pulled these things apart, but I think a biblical worldview brings these together. Morality is connected to our knowledge. And we see this in Romans 1, right? Where we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And so,
and I just want to jump in here and say, this is what the Proverbs talks about over and over again in training the child. And the Proverbs the proverb that is often used to give, that parents use maybe to have hope that their kids will one day come back to the faith that they were raised in and maybe left. But that says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. This is actually talking about habits, the training in the way that they should go. And so that this is what has become normal to them, and then will be just what their life looks like as they get old, go out on their own. They have these habits that this training has accomplished, and that's what the Proverbs is talking about. So, okay, let's talk about a few of these habits.
Because I think if we get into some of the specifics of the habits, it will just unpack more of why of the relationship with discipline, and the Christian worldview, habits, training, and righteousness. We'll start kind of putting all these pieces together.
Yeah. So the first habit that I think is important to think about is the habit of obedience. And this is the habit of, we might want to say first time obedience, but just the habit of obedience. And it seems so basic, but it's absolutely foundational. Learning to submit to one's parents begins to condition our hearts ultimately to live under God's authority. And so this is why it's so important to train your toddlers in obedience, because this habit will serve them well for the rest of their lives. And it's a habit that I would argue you can teach a toddler. And so just this thinking of obedience as a habit that you want to create in your kids.
I think it's helpful, and I would guess that a lot of us haven't thought about obedience as a habit, as something that's habituated. We think of obedience in terms of a mere exertion of the will, of willpower. So obey me, and so in that moment, exert your willpower to do what I've said, which that's certainly possible, and that's part of it. But obedience can, I guess, it can become more natural.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's like thinking of an athlete who, if I get out on, let's say, a baseball field right now, I haven't played baseball in years. I'm out of those habits, so I'm going to swing the bat wrong. My stance is going to be wrong. Versus if I get in the ocean and I surf, right? I'm surfing every week, and I've got habits that I've established. So surfing becomes easier as I do it more. In the same way, whether it's a sport or any really activity, we need to think in terms of these habits, and obedience is one of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I so often have had conversations with other moms where they say, my kids they argue with me every time I tell them to do something. They argue back and they argue back and they argue back. Well, that's a habit that has been created. They've learned mom says something, I argue back, and I'm allowed to push, and then I can push a little more and push a little more. And then probably the habit has developed that we as parents will break down and then give in. That it's important to think about it as a habit that we've created in them and that we can change. And so in the same way, we all know kids that we've been around that have the habit of obedience, that you notice when their parents tell them to do something, they do it. Well, were those kids just born with less of a sin nature than your kid? No. No, they weren't. They weren't born better. They just have been trained in the habit of obedience. And it truly is a habit that we can cultivate in our kids.
Yeah, just this discussion reminded me of a passage in Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews 5:8, it talks about Jesus, the Son. It says, son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered.
Learning.
Pause for a second. We're talking about the Messiah. We're talking about God incarnate. We're talking about Jesus. And the scriptures refer to Jesus, of course, in his human nature as one who learned obedience. And that was particularly from what he suffered. But the idea that Jesus learned obedience, we can learn obedience. This is part of human nature. And so our discipline trains and corrects the will and the affections so that obedience becomes more habituated in our lives, becomes more natural, and becomes easier to do. And I think we've seen that with our kids. There's a lot of hard work you do at the beginning. If you do that hard work early on, I think what we would say is it's become easier as they've gotten older because there's been a habit of obedience.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I think just making that mind shift is important. Okay, we want to go through actually 5 habits. So let's go through a couple more quickly before we get to the end. But the second habit that we would encourage you as parents to cultivate in your children as a family is the habit of self-control. We do not want our kids to be ruled by the I want. Instead, we want them growing and asking the more important question, which is what's right. And so you can cultivate habits. We all know this as adults in self-control. And this is a habit that we want to start to cultivate in our kids.
Yeah, and that's what discipline does. Discipline is at times stopping the will from doing what it desires, and I guess directing it towards what is good and what is right and what is pure and in all that. And so this over time can build self-control. Like how do you get that little kid not to get into the cookie jar? How do they develop self-control? Well, that takes time, and through the habit of obedience, that you can see how obedience and the first habit is connected with self-control. Yeah. You learn obedience, you learn self-control, and you're not ruled then by your desires, your affections, your those kind of things.
Yeah. Okay. The third habit is the habit of unselfishness. And this is truly a habit that you have to cultivate in your kids. We are born with an inclination towards ourselves. We think of ourselves first and foremost easily. And if you ever question that, there's this idea that we're born good and we're born just wanting to share and love others. If you believe that, then I would just encourage you to next time you're at church, go help in the preschool toddler classroom. And you will see how the inclination of every toddler is self-preservation. It's me. We don't have to tell children, think of yourself, not just everybody else in the class. It's the opposite. We have to teach kids to actually see the other people around them and to be thoughtful of them.
Yeah, you don't have to teach selfishness. It comes naturally.
Yes.
And
Yeah, and the teaching of Jesus where he says, love your neighbor as yourself. So we love ourselves.
Well, there's an important distinction there to make,
yeah.
Right? There's a difference between selfishness and self-interest. So when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, there's an appropriate sense of self-love. And so that's the good side of it. And of course, as fallen human beings, we just take those good things and we take them in the wrong direction. And that's where we get the selfishness, where it's appropriate to take care of yourself, to have a self-love that's healthy. But then when we take it too far and only think of ourselves, we become selfish.
Yeah. So this habit of unselfishness is really rooted in that second commandment of love your neighbor as yourself. Teaching our children to have the habit of loving the people around them, of seeing the other people around them, and not just thinking of themselves. And we're going to talk about the practical. We're going to keep getting more practical. So we're going to go through how do you do that, and some really practical ways.
If we just pause here for a second, think about these habits and the fruit they produce. If good discipline can produce obedience and self-control and unselfishness, that sounds like a pretty pleasant kid to be around. Which, let's be honest. There are some of us who struggle with even wanting to be around our kids, right? Like you might be sitting there going, yeah, my kids are terrible to be around.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the fruit of good discipline can be such that it actually is a bonding thing because you want to be around that kind of kid,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So
yeah, for sure. Okay, so 2 more habits, which I think would just fit with what you're saying too. And the fourth one being, and I think this is an important habit, is a habit of thankfulness. And so, yeah, in a practical way, this does mean teaching your kids to say thank you for the things they get and to say please. And I will get pushback when I go and speak to moms groups and I talk about discipline and I talk about training your children in the habit of thankfulness. I will get pushback of saying, should we really force them to say these things even if they don't mean it? And so I always put it back on them and say, well, how else would you train them in thankfulness if you're not forcing them to stop and consider someone just gave you something, or you're asking someone to do something for you. So you're making them realize, oh, I'm not the center of the universe, and someone sacrificed something for me, or I'm asking someone to do something for me. So what comes with that is a thankfulness that we should have. And I just don't know how else you cultivate that in a child than to get them to see, oh, I ought to appreciate the people around me, including mom and dad, just for little things. And so this habit of thankfulness, if we want our children to be people who appreciate others, we need to train them in this habit.
Well, and I think, and additionally, why would we think that we shouldn't force them to do those things, right? Because here's an analogy I've used with parents is like, okay, if your kid said, they woke up one morning and they said, you know what, I don't feel like going to school. I don't want to go to biology class. I don't want to take that test I have today. Would we say, oh, well, if you don't feel that way, then I shouldn't force you to do it because you don't want to do it, right? When it comes to the academic, I don't think any parent's going to take that approach. But when it comes to their discipline or their spiritual training, then we step back and go, well, I don't know if I should force them to say thank you. I don't know if I should force them to go to church. Mm-hmm. And if that's the view, then what does that reveal about how we see those things? Mm-hmm. Like, this is where maybe some of the conversation about what we take to be knowledge comes into play. Like when it comes to school, you go to school to gain knowledge, and so that knowledge of reality is going to help you whether you feel like it or not. It's going to help you, learn a certain field or get a certain job or, whatever. So we're willing to force that. But when it comes to spiritual stuff or moral stuff, maybe it reveals if we don't force those things, if we're not willing to force those things, maybe it reveals that we actually think they're kind of more preferences. Mm-hmm. We don't have strong convictions about their objective moral, nature.
Yeah. And maybe we have a disordering of what we think is the most important thing for our children to learn. So it's appropriate.
Well, if you don't think those things are pieces of knowledge, if you don't think moral laws are pieces of knowledge and that they turn out to just be preferences, then that seems to fit with like, oh, I'm not going to force you to do it. Yeah. It's that view will undermine your discipline. Yeah. And something like developing a habit of unselfishness. Yes, we in fact, that's our job as parents, is to get our kids to do the things they don't want to do. That's our job. And that of course it takes, I think, conviction and courage. Mm-hmm. And those go hand in hand. Yeah.
So it's appropriate to stop your children after lunch with grandma and say, go tell grandma thank you for lunch, and give her a hug and show her that you appreciate what she did. This is important, and this is how we train in thankfulness. We make them stop. They've just had a good lunch, or they just got a birthday present that they love. Stop for a minute and thank the appropriate person for what was given to you. And this is how we cultivate them to, yes, unselfishness, of course, is connected to this one, but just to have a heart of thankfulness. It trains their affections. This is what we mean by that. Okay, so the last habit that we'll talk about before our next episodes of getting really practical on what discipline can look like is the habit of service. And serving others is a habit that we want to cultivate in our kids. And of course, it's connected with the unselfishness. It can be connected also with the habit of thankfulness, but it's a physical training of their bodies to do acts of service that maybe they don't want to go and do. But it's a habit that you can cultivate in your kids that will be something that will become what they see as a normal part of life, that we serve one another.
Yeah, and I think as we think about habits, let's connect this with discipline, just explicitly here, because someone might say, well, does this have to do with discipline? Mm-hmm. Because I think we have this maybe assumption like discipline is punishment, right? But remember how we define discipline. Discipline is training to correct. So discipline might be a subset of that. There might be times when you should, punishment is a subset of that. There are times when punishment is a part of discipline, but discipline does not equal punishment. Mm-hmm. Discipline is this larger training for correction or training for righteousness, really, if we want to kind of use some theological language. Discipline is training for righteousness. And so, yeah, these habits fit right in with that because it's not just about punishing.
Yeah.
And so that might be some correction that we need as parents to maybe shed some of the baggage we have when it comes to discipline.
Yeah.
Because we might think, discipline means I got to put my kid in timeout, or I got to spank my kid, or I got to, ground my kid or whatever.
Yeah, we often think about discipline in the times where we're angry or frustrated by something. It's like, now I'm frustrated, so now I have to discipline. And what we're saying is actually discipline is a whole life. And it's this formation of all these habits in our kids that we want to cultivate. And it isn't just the times where, they've messed up or disobeyed or something. That is not all that discipline is. It's so much more. And so that's why, we could go on with more habits, but I think, the habit of obedience, the habit of self-control, the habit of unselfishness, the habit of thankfulness, and the habit of service are good examples of what we're talking about in this full picture, this full Christian worldview of what it means to discipline our children.
Yeah, those would be core things. Mm-hmm. And so, we're not going to be completely exhaustive in this series on discipline, but I think we're laying that foundation. And so if we just kind of pause here for a moment, like let's kind of connect all of the dots now, right? Discipline from a Christian worldview starts with God, starts with who he is, that he is a moral being. The theological term we use for that is holiness. He's holy, he's righteous. And so the world that he's created reflects his nature. So we live in a moral universe. And as parents, the family has been created by God, instituted by God as the primary place to train and correct a child, ultimately so they can relate rightly to their creator. So discipline isn't just for mom and dad. Discipline is ultimately for the child and their relationship with God. And that right there, if we just remember that, as I discipline my kid, I'm actually preparing them to enter into a relationship with their creator. That is one of the main goals of discipline. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the goods of discipline. And that can be just motivating. It can give us perseverance to stick with it, even when it doesn't feel good. We know that there's this long-term goal that we're shooting for. And so when we start with the Christian worldview, and think about this properly, it fits, number one, with the way the world really is. It fits with the nature of reality. But then number two, it can really motivate us and give us the strength and the courage, because we know what that end goal is. We know the benefits. We know that discipline is a path to flourishing, to human flourishing, all of that. Now we're ready to get into the practical stuff. Okay, let's get down and dirty on this stuff. And how do I deal with the tantrum that my 2-year-old throws when I'm at the grocery store? Or, what do I do with my kid when they say no and then they turn around and walk away? And we're going to get to those details in the next probably couple episodes, because we now also want to look at, hey, there's different levels, different ages or levels of development, stages where certain things are appropriate. So got a lot more on discipline to come.
What about questions? We're still taking some
Yes.
of those. We're getting some good questions in. And yeah, if you want to send in some specific questions of discipline things you're thinking about or battling with at your home, you can, how can they send them to us? info@maventruth.com.
Yeah, send an email to info@maventruth.com. You can go onto our Facebook page, the Maven Facebook page, and send in questions there. In fact, maybe we should put up a Facebook post and ask people to give their questions. We want to collect those questions. I think we could do probably a whole episode just dealing with the questions that people have. So make sure you send in your questions.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.